Hey everybody, this is a section from the chapter Marxism and Existentialism on the Philosophy and Theory of Jean-Paul Sartre. The last section from that was read was titled Philosophy and Existentialism 2. And then this video is going to be a recording of a chapter titled A Brief Excursus on an Element of Hegelian Philosophy. So here we go. It must be noted at the outset, by way of qualification, that only a few lines of inquiry can be sketched here, as the literature on the subject has become too complex. Consequently, the following remarks are merely cursory in nature. Hegel's categories of being and nothingness can only be meaningfully discussed within the context of the problem of the beginning. It is the question of Wissenschaft, parentheses, science/systematic knowledge, in parentheses, and simultaneously the motivating premise that Bildung, parentheses, cultivation/education, in parentheses, should evolve into Wissenschaft, that is at stake. Footnote, quote, there is a period in the formation of an age, as in the formation of the individual, when the primary concern is the acquisition and assertion of the principle in its undeveloped intensity, but with the higher demand that it becomes science, end quote. Hegel, Science of Logic, 1. End footnote. This also raises the question, quote, with what must the beginning in the sciences be made, end quote. Joseph Schmidt. Footnote. Formal logic treats logical forms as disparate, implying that the unity of logic can reside only in the subjective, in logical reason. See Kornelia Hafner's Thesen zu Joseph Schmidt, Einleitungskapitel aus Hegels Wissenschaft der Logik. Hegel's critique can also be applied to modern variants, such as propositional logic. The rules of the algorithm are predetermined and consequently external to the subject matter. One footnote. In ordinary consciousness, science appears bound by rules and laws, which can grasp the relationship of its object only in a nominalist, i.e. external manner, as in empiricism. This question is therefore transposed into the inquiry regarding the beginning of logic, which leaves behind this merely external relationship, but reveals a difficulty inherent in the beginning itself, namely that of being the beginning of philosophy and the beginning of logic as Wissenschaft itself. Yet in contrast to ordinary consciousness, the following holds true for philosophy, quote, that which is familiar is not known, precisely because it is familiar, end quote. Hegel. And there's some footnotes here. Footnote, quote, philosophy, insofar as philosophy is to be a science, cannot, borrow philosophy's method from a subordinate science like mathematics, or make use of reasoning based on external reflection. Rather, it can only be the nature of the content itself that moves within scientific cognition, given that this immanent reflection of the content is precisely what posits and generates its determination. End quote. And I'm not sure that quote is from. I think it might be from Wolfgang Dettel. Anyway, and the next footnote I think is from the same person. Quote, the beginning of philosophy must be either something mediated or something immediate. Yet it is easy to show that it can be neither the one nor the other, and thus each mode of beginning is refuted. The principle of a philosophy does indeed express a beginning, but not so much a subjective one as an objective one, the beginning of all things, end quote. Wolfgang Dettel. It is the semblance of objectivity that is alluded to here. End footnote. Back to the body. This establishes the distinction between philosophy and logic. While philosophy deals with, quote, concrete objects, end quote, logic is concerned with, quote, complete abstraction, end quote. Hegel, Wissenschaft der Logik, 1. Back to the body. Orientation toward rules, laws, applications, and representations, which constitute the subject matter of, quote, natural logic, end quote, remains, however, itself, quote, unconscious. In contrast to the philosophy of the understanding, the significance of spirit is emphasized, especially its, quote, logical nature, end quote, as it is understood to be the condition for the content of logic. In the phenomenology of spirit, consciousness, on its path from immediacy to, quote, pure knowledge, presents itself with, quote, pure essences as they are in and for themselves, end quote. These are, quote, pure thoughts, or spirit thinking its own essence. Their, quote, self-movement is that, quote, through which science constitutes itself and of which it is the exposition, end quote. Hegel. Sorry, I lost my spot. In the phenomenology of spirit, consciousness, on its path from immediacy to, quote, pure knowledge, presents consciousness's self with, quote, pure essences that are in and for themselves, end quote. Hegel. These are, quote, pure thoughts, or spirit thinking its own essence. Their, quote, self-movement is that, quote, through which science constitutes science's self, and of which it is the exposition, end quote. Hegel. Only by following this self-constructing path is philosophy capable of, quote, only by following this self-constructing path is philosophy capable of being, quote, demonstrated science, end quote. In logic, a step is taken further away from immediate consciousness. The focus then shifts to the elements that constitute the content of logic. These are the forms of thought. However, forms of thought are linguistic results. Categories of thought are logical ones. Yet the object of thought is, quote, truth, which must be, quote, stated as the object and purpose of logic, end quote. It is, therefore, this that must be discussed. And there's a number of footnotes here that I don't know what they're connected to. Footnote, under this heading, Hegel largely subsumes Kantian philosophy. No systematic reference is made to these points here for various reasons. Firstly, Hegel merely adopts many of Kant's terms while assigning them different meanings. Secondly, he misunderstands numerous categories such as the thing in itself, substance, interpreted nominalistically, the separation of form and matter, parenthesis, i.e. as an external relationship between concept and object, implying that forms are external to contents, thereby rendering them finite and creating the problem of their inability to grasp infinite truth, etc. End parenthesis. Finally, he argues that his logic, founded on the principle of identity, aims not at truth but merely as a, quote, correctness of cognitions, end quote. This misses the point of the Kantian procedure, which seeks the conditions for the possibility of cognition itself within the cognition of forms. In Kant, the concept of substance appears, among other places, in the table of categories under, quote, 3, relation A, inherence and subsistence, parenthesis, substantia et accident, in parenthesis, end quote. The concept of substance necessarily enters into science, but is not science's result. The discussion of phenomena and noumena, which explains the extent to which science lays claim to, quote, metaphysical concepts. For Kant, this constitutes a critique of science, as seen, for instance, when substance is treated as a, quote, posited moment, end quote, in chemistry. Thirdly, he attempts to portray Kant as a philosopher of the Verstand, the faculty of the understanding. By contrast, any substantive engagement with Kantian philosophy, setting aside a few laudatory remarks, occurs only implicitly. Footnote, quote, consciousness is spirit as a concrete entity. Specifically, knowledge caught up in externality. Yet the progression of this object rests solely, like the development of all natural and spiritual life, upon the nature of the pure essences that constitute the content of logic, and Hegel. And footnote. Footnote, quote, the most important point for the nature of spirit is the relationship not only of what is in itself to what it actually is, but of what it knows itself to be, end quote. Hegel. And footnote. Footnote. Pure essences are to constitute the content of logic. See Heinz Rüttges, Der Begriff der Methode in der Philosophie Hegels, published in 1981, the method as the form of the self-movement of the content in the science of logic. The fundamental problem regarding the reduction of pure concepts to pure essences. And footnote. Footnote. The forms of thought appear to be presupposed in much the same way as Kant's categories. It is claimed that Kant would not admit that we can form concepts of the nature or essence in things. Hegel, however, also emphasizes the active side when Hegel asserts that thinking is, quote, our most proper, most inward activity, end quote, and that, quote, the objective concept of things, end quote, constitutes, quote, the thing itself, end quote. Yet here he shifts the knowledge of, quote, things, i.e. empirical phenomena, into the concept, thereby transposing Vico's axiom into the realm of spirit. We know only what we think. The forms of thought serve as the object, uniting form and content. The approach of logic, which posits the difference between consciousness and the object of knowledge as sublated, and allows thought to find its content solely within its own forms, not only causes any, quote, outside of thought to vanish, but also presupposes, quote, absolute knowledge, that is, having attained objective knowledge via phenomenology through the various shapes of consciousness, one stands within the truth. Footnote, the aim is to present the, quote, realm of thought philosophically, that is, in its own immanent activity, or what amounts to the same thing in its necessary development, end quote, with, quote, forms of thought, end quote, serving as its material. Footnote, quote, it is an advantage for a language to possess a wealth of logical expressions, specifically distinctive and separate ones, but are the determinations of thought themselves, end quote. Philosophy aims at truth, yet as is stated with regard to contemplative thought, the task is, quote, to demonstrate the necessity of its content and to prove both being itself and the determinations of its objects, end quote. Quote, any acquaintance with them appears insufficient, and making or accepting presuppositions and assurances seems inadmissible. Yet the difficulty of making a start arises at the same time, since a beginning of something as something immediate presupposes something, or rather is itself such a presupposition, end quote. Hegel. Okay, back to the body. This is addressed in 5 different approaches regarding the problem of the beginning. 1. After traversing the phenomenology of spirit, determining the beginning of logic cannot be achieved via a concept of absolute knowledge, because such knowledge, being mediated, does not constitute a beginning, but rather as a concept it already points back to its own presuppositions. If pure knowledge as simple immediacy, 2. If pure knowledge as simple immediacy were to become pure being, then knowledge would vanish within it, leaving no content behind. 3. The, quote, beginning, qua beginning, is supposed to be immediate and free of presuppositions. This reveals a problem, for it turns out that this conceptual approach leads to the, quote, identity of identity and non-identity, end quote, as a, quote, first most abstract definition of the absolute, end quote, to which subsequent concepts must be ascribed as, quote, more determinate and richer definitions of this absolute, end quote, a path that ultimately lands one in a dogmatic mode of procedure. Four. Thus Hegel continues, exploring the various approaches one ought to begin with the subject matter itself. However, this requirement likewise leads to an aporia between immediacy and mediation, and to the rejection of a beginning with the, quote, I, since the latter traces back to the first conceptual model. 5. Therefore, the beginning is to be made with the absolute as pure being. With this, the concept of nothing is posited. Yet if the absolute is taken as the beginning of science, it is merely a, quote, first immediate simple determination, end quote. And knowledge, as thinking knowledge, is something that emerges only successively. The pure, simple beginning is thus something that has not yet moved forward. Nevertheless, one thereby possesses a simple beginning. But let us examine these 5 models of the beginning somewhat more closely. Okay. There's a number of footnotes here. Footnote, it reflects upon itself as its own content, which is the form of knowledge, and footnote, quote, knowledge has vanished in this unity and has left behind no distinction from it, and thus no determination for it, end quote, Hegel. Therefore, there is, quote, no, quote, something or any content present that could be used to make the determinate beginning, end quote, Hegel. Footnote, quote, if, for instance, out of impatience with the consideration of the abstract beginning, one were to say that one ought not to begin with the beginning, but directly from the subject matter, then this subject matter is nothing but that empty being. For what the subject matter is, that is precisely what is to emerge only in the course of the science, and what cannot be presupposed as known prior to it, end quote. Hegel, end footnote. Footnote here. Do I have the thing what this is referencing? This is in reference to the sentence. However, this requirement likewise leads to an aporia between immediacy and mediation, and the rejection of a beginning with the, quote, I, since the latter traces back to the first conceptual model. And the footnote says, here Hegel distances himself from his own earlier reflections in the Critical Journal. Quote, however, one original starting point for philosophy, which has gained renown in recent times, cannot go entirely unmentioned, beginning with the, quote, I. For the, quote, I, this immediate self-consciousness appears at first partly as something immediate and partly as something known in a far higher sense than any ordinary representation. The, quote, I, by contrast, is the simple certainty of itself, yet the, quote, I in general is also, at the same time, a concrete entity. For the, quote, I to serve as the beginning and foundation of philosophy, the isolation of this concrete entity is required, the absolute act whereby the, quote, I is purified of itself, and enters consciousness as an abstract, quote, I. Yet this pure, quote, I is not something immediate, nor is it the familiar, ordinary, quote, I of our consciousness, the point from which science ought to be directly linked for everyone. That act would in fact be nothing other than the elevation to the standpoint of pure knowledge, where the distinction between the subjective and the objective is vanished, end quote. Hegel. So much for the critique of Fichte. Other authors approach the matter differently. While Jürgen Werner reads contradictionally through the lens of Fichte, see Jürgen Werner, Darstellung als Kritik, Hegels Frage nach dem Anfang der Wissenschaft. Presentation as critique, Hegel's question concerning the beginning of science. A similar approach is found in Adorno. By reproducing the Hegelian reductionism that reads Kant through Fichte to a large extent, if not entirely, Hegel is in turn reduced to Fichtean terms. This concerns A, the discourse regarding the quote, identity system in Hegel. Although Adorno sometimes knows better when Adorno speaks of the quote, identity of absolute knowledge, end quote. Corresponding to this reductionism is the conflation of production, social labor, and exchange, which are subsumed into a systemic context. B. The reduction of Kant's concept of the subject to Hegel's, and of Hegel's to a, quote, identity of subject and object, end quote. Regarding the critique of Adorno's reception of Kant and Hegel, and setting aside the section on Marx, which is of no interest here, see Annette Bargholz, Identität und objektiver Widerspruch zum Problem immanenter Kritik in Adornos negativer Dialektik. In Diethard Behrens' edited volume Materialistische Theorie und Praxis zum Verhältnis von kritischer Theorie und Kritik der politischen Ökonomie. Published in Freiburg, 2005. Okay, and footnote. Footnote, the absolute could not be absolute if it were the consciousness of a, quote, other. Since there is no such thing as objectless thinking, an absolute I cannot be constructed. Or to use Hölderlin's phrasing, quote, thus for the absolute I, there is no object, for it would not contain all reality in vain. Yet a consciousness without an object is inconceivable, end quote. Hölderlin. Consequently, quote, no consciousness is conceivable, end quote, within the, quote, absolute I, end quote. And consciousness as an absolute I is, quote, for me, nothing, end quote. Friedrich Hölderlin. Letter to Hegel dated January 26, 1795. See also Diethard Behrens, Der kritische Gehalt, or Gehalt, I'm not sure how to say that, Der kritische Gehalt der Marxischen Wertformanalyse, the critical current of Marx's analysis of the value form, in the book Gesellschaft und Erkenntnis, Society and Knowledge, Zur materialistischen Erkenntnis und Ökonomiekritik, on the materialist critique of knowledge and economics. End footnote. Footnote, Re 1. The, quote, element of thought that is free and for itself, unquote, the idea of, quote, pure knowledge, is posited here as the logical beginning. Footnote, quote, it is hereby mediated by the fact that pure knowing is the ultimate absolute truth of consciousness, end quote. The exposition of the phenomenology of spirit is presupposed here. In this respect, the logic takes as its presupposition the science of the spirit as it appears, which contains and demonstrates the necessity, and thus the proof of the truth, of the standpoint that is pure knowing, as well as its mediation in general. On the problem of mediation, see Manfred Baum, Anmerkungen zum Verhältnis von Systematik und Dialektik by Hegel. Notes on the relationship between systematics and dialectics in Hegel. In the book, Hegel's Science of Logic. End footnote. Back to the body. It has the series of its forms of mediation behind it, and it is what? The idea of pure knowledge. The element of thought that is free and for itself. The idea of, quote, pure knowledge is posited here as the logical beginning. It has the series of its forms of mediation behind it. Logic is therefore to be regarded as, quote, pure science, i.e. pure knowledge in the entire scope of its development. End quote. Hegel, Science of Logic. What manifests itself here is a form of self-knowledge. This has become unmediated and immediate, and thus is no longer knowledge. Footnote. Quote, pure knowing, having converged into this unity, has sublated all relation to an other and to mediation. It is the undifferentiated. Quote, this undifferentiated state thus itself ceases to be knowledge. Only simple immediacy is present. End quote. End footnote. As something immediate, it is a, quote, expression of reflection, end quote. It must be conceived in relation to the, quote, distinction from the mediated, end quote. Logic is supposed to be the beginning of science, yet here in this context it appears merely as a result. In this respect, the idea that there is a continuity from the phenomenology of spirit to the logic must also be abandoned. At the very least, one must assume a shift in levels, for absolute knowledge, being mediated, cannot constitute a beginning, since such a beginning would then be posited within the contradiction of its own presuppositions. Footnote, quote, pure knowing having converged with this unity has sublated all relation to an other and to mediation. I think I already read this one. Footnote, quote, in its true expression, therefore, this simple immediacy is pure being. Just as pure knowledge is meant to signify nothing but knowledge as such, wholly abstract, so too pure being is meant to signify nothing but being in general, being nothing else, without any further determination or content, end quote. Immediacy is, however, also a negative concept and relates to mediations. Footnote, 2 moments must be noted. 1. Thought is conceived at times as existing within truth, and at other times as moving within the distinctions of consciousness. 2. In Hegel's philosophy, the logical self is not grounded as a category antecedent to the concept of spirit, as if it were a Platonic construct. End footnote. Back to the body. Re 2. The start is therefore to be made with being. Quote, but if no presupposition is to be made, and the beginning itself is to be taken immediately, then it is determined solely by the fact that it is to be the beginning of logic, of thought as such. End quote. The beginning must therefore be, quote, absolute, i.e. presuppositionless, or a, quote, abstract beginning, end quote, and immediate. Quote, the beginning is then pure being. End quote. Footnote: the conception of footnote: this conception corresponds to a common schema. This conception posits that being, at being's lowest level, quote, the indeterminate immediate, end quote, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, constitutes the essence of being. That at an indeterminate level it appears as absolute substance, as absolute form. And that at its highest level it presents itself as the absolute idea, as the totality in this form, which freely releases itself into nature, and finally returns to being as a return into the ground. And footnote, quote, it must therefore be simply something immediate, or rather just the immediate itself, just as it cannot have a determination in relation to something else. Neither can it contain any determination within itself, no content, for such a thing would imply distinction and the relation of different things to one another, and thus mediation. End quote. Hegel. Back to the body. However, the notion, as found in Reinhold, of a procedure of regression to the ground is itself problematic because it is essentially circular. The figure of advancing as a regression to the ground depends on what was used to make the beginning. The ground then becomes the presupposition of the first element. Against this, the role of reflection must be asserted. Quote, what is essential for science is not so much that the beginning be something purely immediate, but rather that the whole of it be circular within itself, in which the first becomes the last and the last becomes the first. End quote. Reinhold. No, let me see. No, Hegel, excuse me. Thus, it emerges that the regression to the ground is the result of a movement of thought. For Hegel, the consciousness drawn from this is, quote, thus the beginning of philosophy is the foundation that remains present and preserved throughout all subsequent developments, that which remains entirely imminent to its further determinations, end quote. Hegel. Logic. While pure being was initially the beginning, as form and content, and thus the, quote, absolutely immediate, end quote, it turns out to be, quote, equally absolutely mediated, end quote. This points back to the problem of the beginning of philosophy, which at this stage is said to be merely an empty word, end quote. For, quote, pure knowledge yields only this negative determination, that it is to be the abstract beginning, end quote. Hegel, logic. A couple of footnotes here. Quote, the insight that the absolutely true must be a result, and conversely, that a result presupposes an initial truth, which, however, because it is the initial element, is not necessary when viewed objectively and is not yet known from the subjective side, has in recent times given rise to the idea that philosophy can begin only with a hypothetical and problematic truth, and that philosophizing can therefore initially be nothing more than a process of searching, end quote. This searching is then the corresponding figure, quote, it presents the matter in such a way that the forward movement in philosophy is actually a movement backward and a process of grounding. Only through this does it emerge that what one began with was not merely something arbitrarily assumed, but was in fact partly the truth and partly the initial truth. End quote. Hegel. Yet this is merely a process of reciprocal abstraction and inference. Footnote. Here Hegel employs a metaphor whose inadequacy he himself recognizes in the subsequent reception. The circle, as a return to the starting point, and the spiral are frequently taken not merely as illustrations, but as the content itself. However, these concepts have been problematic since the time of Kepler, and insofar as Hegel referred to Kepler as early as his habilitation thesis, he had already dismissed them regarding their actual substance. End footnote. It possesses something of a substrate, or to use Aristotle's terms, it has a substantial character. Footnote, and this is in relation to the sentence, while pure being was initially the beginning as form and content, and thus the, quote, absolutely immediate, end quote, it turns out to be, quote, equally absolutely mediated, end quote. Hegel. And thus also the possibility of making, and the footnote says, and thus also the possibility of making a beginning. End footnote. And footnote. Pure knowledge has become being in being's simple immediacy. Here, knowledge has vanished, and with knowledge the possibility of making a beginning. Back to the text. Re 3. Should one, then, simply begin with a, quote, pure being? Such a beginning would be, quote, wholly abstract, wholly general, wholly form, without any content. End quote. Hegel. Yet in this state it is nothing and being in one, and thus consists of moments that are already distinguished. It is a beginning prior to the beginning, or that which begins both is and is not at the same time. Quote, the beginning thus contains being as that which distances itself from non-being, or sublates being as something opposed to itself, end quote. Hegel. Being and nothing are therefore, quote, in immediate union within it, or rather it is their undifferentiated unity. End quote. Hegel. And there's some footnotes here, or a footnote. Footnote, quote, and this is in relation to the line, in this state, the beginning is nothing and being in one, and thus consists of moments that are already distinguished. Quote, it is as yet nothing, and it is to become something. The beginning is not pure nothingness, but a nothingness from which something is to proceed. Being is thus already contained in the beginning. The beginning therefore contains both being and nothingness. It is the unity of being and nothingness, or it is non-being that is at the same time being, and being that is at the same time non-being. End quote. Back to the body. From this follows not only the, quote, concept of the unity of being and nothing, end quote, or, quote, of the unity of being distinguished and being undistinguished, or of the identity of identity and non-identity, end quote, but also the view that this concept is the most abstract one. The beginning is then conceived as something known, thereby becoming something immediate. However, the relation of the beginning as something immediate to the concretes is itself merely mediation, merely subjective. Here a, quote, first and a, quote, other are presupposed, for if such a distinction already implies a, quote, progression, then it cannot be a beginning. The beginning of the beginning has shown, as the inquiry proceeds, that one arrives in this way at the, quote, identity of identity and non-identity, end quote, as a first determination of the absolute, to which further determinations are assigned, thereby demonstrating a procedure that has elsewhere been termed metaphysical dogmatism. Thus one must indeed begin with the subject matter itself, quote, being as the wholly empty, end quote. Yet reason is implicitly contained therein as a driving factor. An aporia arises here. The beginning is posited as being both mediated and immediate at the same time. And there's some footnotes. Footnote this footnote's in relation to the sentence. From this follows not only the, quote, concept of the unity of being and nothing, end quote, or, quote, of the unity of being distinguished and being undistinguished, or of the identity of identity and non-identity, end quote, but also the view that this concept is the most abstract one. And the footnote says, this is conceived in a specific way, quote, what is usually called, quote, concept must be distinguished from the concept in the speculative sense, end quote. Hegel. Regarding what is usually called concept, it is said, quote, that the infinite cannot be grasped by concepts, end quote. Hegel. And footnote. Footnote. And this is in reference to that same sentence. If it were merely a matter of wanting to have definitions or the bare name of the absolute. And footnote. And this is in relation to the sentence, thus one must indeed begin with the subject matter itself, being as the wholly empty, end quote. And the footnote says, but even this has implications. Quote, consciousness is the appearing spirit, which frees itself on its path from its immediacy and external concreteness, becomes pure knowledge, which makes those pure essences themselves, as they are in and for themselves, its object. They are pure thoughts. Spirit's own essence. Their self-movement is their spiritual life and is that through which science constitutes science's self and of which science is the exposition. End quote. Hegel. Footnote. Quote, understanding determines and holds fast to determinations. Reason is negative and dialectical because reason dissolves the determinations of the understanding into nothing. It is positive because it generates the universal and comprehends the particular within it. End quote. Reason, however, is spirit. Spirit is, quote, the negative. It negates the simple, thereby positing the determinate difference of the understanding. It dissolves this difference just as much, and is thus dialectical. Yet it does not remain within the nothingness of this result, but is equally positive within it, thereby establishing the initial simple, but as a universal that is concrete within itself. End quote. Hegel. On this, see Lorenz P. Puntel, or Puntel, Verstand und Vernunft. In Hegel's Wissenschaft der Logik, which I think is understanding and reason in Hegel's Science of Logic, but I'm not sure. In Dieter Henrich's edited volume, Hegel's Wissenschaft der Logik, Formation und Reconstruction, which I guess is Hegel's Science of Logic, Formation and Reconstruction, publication of the International Hegel Association, Volume 16, 1986. Re 4. The proposal is to begin with the subject matter. This approach has already been subjected to criticism, given that the subject matter reveals itself to be pure and empty at the outset. Only as the inquiry proceeds does the subject matter become what emerges, quote, in the course of the science, end quote. Hegel. This points to a reflection on method. There's a footnote. Let us then summarize briefly. Logic, that is the intention to begin with the subject matter itself. Therefore, since it cannot begin immediately with the rules and laws of thought, for that would leave it external to the objects, it must, if it is to be a science of pure thinking, ground itself without presuppositions. Here, however, determinations are already posited. It cannot simply be understood as formal, or that too would be external. Thus, the separation of content from form must be abandoned, as must the view that the material of knowledge is a ready-made world transcending thought. If matter and form are conceived as determinate, matter and form are separated, thought finds them already present. If the critique of the forms of the understanding concludes that these forms cannot be applied to things, then thought too must be external to them. Consequently, though differently than in quote, criticism, one must have recourse to the concept of a pure science by falling back on absolute knowledge, which belongs to the genesis rather than the presupposition. Pure science must emancipate itself from the opposition of consciousness. It must be pure self-developing self-consciousness, a conscious concept as that which is in and for itself. And footnote back to the body. There is a specific debate regarding the problem of Hegel's procedure, to which brief reference should be made here. It must therefore be noted the beginning of philosophy and logic is to be taken with the simple and immediate. This posits not only a mediation between the absence of presuppositions and the beginning itself, but also implicitly raises the question of what the content actually is, beginning, critique, or grounding. According to Jürgen Werner, quote, the genesis of the beginning into becoming, end quote, must be understood as a, quote, immanent process, end quote, and its exposition as a, quote, immanent critique, end quote. What remains ungrasped here is that this type of critique drives the disciplinary subject matter only to the point where it becomes science, i.e. capable of theory, and thus a presupposition of the exposition, which is in that respect something more. This is evident from the fact that Hegel argues against the separation of content and form, and of critique and exposition. And there's some footnotes here. First footnotes in relation to the sentence. This posits not only a mediation between the absence of presuppositions and the beginning itself, but also implicitly raises the question of what the content actually is, beginning, critique, or grounding. And the footnote says, according to this, the issue is a beginning that grounds itself within the critique. End footnote. The next footnote says, characterizing Hegel's method as immanent critique is a widespread practice. See Theodor Adorno, Aspekte, and Adorno, Erfahrungsgehalt, or Gehalt. Erfahrungsgehalt. Quote, the progression is a permanent critique of what precedes it, and such critique complements the synthetically progressing one. End quote. Adorno. Hegelian philosophy is characterized by the emphasis that it is, quote, in fact, essentially negative critique, end quote. Adorno. Adorno also notes, quote, to grasp the motive behind the critique of science, that what lies closest at hand, what is immediately certain to the individual subject, is not the ground of truth, not absolutely certain, not, quote, immediate. Yet the, quote, restorative liberal, end quote, Hegel, is nonetheless committed to the, quote, ideal of reconstruction, end quote. Footnote. See Jürgen Werner, a piece abbreviated Darstellung als Kritik. I guess that's presentation as critique, as well as reference to Hegel's critique of the assumptions of antinomies. See also Adorno, Erfahrungsgehalt. Erfahrungsgehalt. End footnote. Two methodological problems can be identified. One, it is impossible to envisage a, quote, critique of knowledge prior to knowledge itself, end quote, which implies that, quote, critique must present itself as knowledge and knowledge as critique, end quote. Jürgen Werner. Logic must constitute the, quote, justification of its own beginning within the critique of that very beginning, end quote. Jürgen Werner. Footnote. To mention a parallel point here, quote, if one were to attempt to, quote, explain from the outset all phenomena that seemingly contradict the law, one would have to provide the science prior to the science itself, end quote. Marx, letter to Kugelmann, dated July 11th, 1868. End footnote. Back to the body. 2. The problem presents itself as follows. Quote, on the one hand, the beginning must be determinately defined. On the other hand, however, precisely because of its position at the start of a process of determination, the beginning must be the indeterminate immediate. As an absolute beginning, it is necessarily indeterminate. End quote. Jürgen Werner. Yet following Werner's interpretation a little further here, the beginning is also a, quote, critique of the one-sidedness of a merely abstract beginning, end quote. It is thus simultaneously self-critique, exposition, and critique. Footnote. Werner follows Teunissen here. However, the adoption of a hermeneutic perspective to which Teunissen yields entails a separation between object and presentation and lacks essential justification. Back to the body. If the beginning was conceived as presuppositionless, yet intended to be immediate, it turned out that the immediacy here was a mere form, the reflection of which had to be posited as grounded in itself. The absence of presuppositions was thus the result of reflection. Thus, quote, the activity of the subjective conception is, on the one hand, merely the development of what is already present in the object, because the object itself is nothing but the totality of the concept, end quote. Hegel. Reflection is thus to be understood as a process occurring within the horizon of totality. In this context, an appearance of subjective certainty arises, which can only accompany the objectivity of the beginning as something external to it. The logical element then appears to be presupposed, yet the circle of reflection is itself only an apparent one. For, quote, this negativity, which is identical with immediacy, and thus the immediacy that is identical with negativity, is essence. Semblance is therefore essence itself, yet essence in a determinateness, though in such a way that this is merely its moment, and essence is the shining of itself within itself. End quote. Hegel. Two main variants emerged in the reception of this idea, an analytical one and a subjective, i.e. hermeneutic one. And there's a footnote. There's some footnotes here. The following reads quite differently. Adorno regards the, quote, theory of totality as the sum of contradictions, end quote, as Hegel's own. Quote, yet the reason behind that unification into totality is itself unreason, the totality of the negative, end quote. Adorno. Footnote, quote, reflection is thus the movement which in turn, quote, reflection is thus the movement which in being a return is only therein that which begins or that which returns, end quote. Adorno. I think that's Adorno. And I'm not sure now. Fuck. And I think that quote that I just read, that was earlier, this negativity, which is identical with immediacy, and thus the immediacy that is identical with negativity is essence. Semblance is therefore essence itself, yet essence in a determinateness, though in such a way that this is merely its moment, and essence is the shining of itself within itself. I think that might be Adorno. Back to the body, two main variants emerged in the reception of this idea, an analytical one and a subjective, i.e. hermeneutic one. The analytical approach seeks to discuss immediacy against the backdrop of an assumption regarding the possibility of giving positive form to the synthetic. Thus, Trendelenburg posits pure being and nothing as rest, and deems the transition to becoming impossible. In this view, however, the categories are already presupposed. The form and content of the science remain separate, and the beginning is intended to serve as a fixed presupposition. Consequently, the science remains unfounded. The hermeneutic approach follows a different path of interpretation. For it, the recourse to reflection is decisive. The criterion, however, lies in the form of reflection's distinction from itself, that is, in mediation. For hermeneutics, it resides in language, sometimes in the word itself. The horizon of meaning that precedes all cognition, which hermeneutics stakes out in advance, dissolves both concept and cognition. This view is derived essentially from Heidegger, Sartre too following this interpretation. Hence, it is natural to appeal to a, quote, logical instinct of language, end quote, that negates the content of knowledge. Footnote, and this quote is from an Adolf Trendelenburg, quote, "It aims at the objectivity of thought, but it also proceeds from it as the withdrawal of all objectifications." Oh no, I misspoke. This quote is from Hans-Georg Gadamer. Quote, "It aims at the objectivity of thought, but it also proceeds from it as the withdrawal of all objectifications into the sheltering power of the word," end quote. Hans-Georg Gadamer. And, quote, "But within the linguistic nature of all thought, a counter-direction for thought remains requisite, one that transforms the concept back into the connection word," end quote. Gadamer. Quote, "The more radically objectifying thought reflects upon itself and unfolds the experience of dialectics, the more clearly it points to what it is not. Dialectics must withdraw into hermeneutics," end quote. Hans-Georg Gadamer. End footnote. Footnote, the distinction between knowledge and consciousness. This relationship appears in Heidegger as the, quote, essence of the primordial nothing. Let me repeat that. Footnote, the distinction between knowledge and consciousness. This relationship appears in Heidegger as the, quote, essence of the primordial nothing, like that. Nothing in like a in the verb sense. Nothing, nothing, unquote. Gadamer. See Martin Heidegger, Identität und Differenz, Identity and Difference. And Heidegger's Was ist Metaphysik? What is metaphysics? See also Wolfram Melior. Back to the body. Contrary to various attempts to interpret the problem of the beginning through interpolations from the logic of essence, Werner, for instance, seeks to conceive the progression as a development, as a process of further determination. This is equated with the, quote, identification of beginning and method, end quote, and implies that being is not viewed as something static or as the, quote, same, end quote. Reflection is to be understood as the, quote, constitution of a process, end quote. The beginning as an aporia-laden construct remains the precondition for this development. Here, positiveness is reflection. There's a couple of footnotes here. Footnote: in this context, recourse is frequently had to the passage concerning difference in Heidegger's Science of Logic 2. End footnote. For Jürgen Werner, this, and this is referring to this, the sentence, positedness is reflection. For Werner, that positedness is reflection. Occasionally allows for a regression into a metaphysical interpretation in order to present Hegel's quote system. End footnote. Quote, this is back to the body. Quote, as reflection, however, positedness determines the concept's being in itself, thereby making it meaningful to speak of a relational difference between the two moments in the first place, end quote. Quote, as reflection, positedness is consequently the presentation of the contradiction, end quote. Jürgen Werner. Thus the start is to be made with the absolute, as absolute identity, which itself contains the problem of the infinite. Yet here appears merely, quote, as, quote, empty word and mere being, end quote, unquote, and as a moment of a specific presentation not separately addressed here, since it emerges within the initial determinations vis-a-vis an other, vis-a-vis itself, and as a beginning. There's some footnotes here. Footnote. Hegel states, quote, that one must begin with the absolute, end quote. Hegel. At the same time, the problem of the beginning must be recalled here. Quote, it is as yet nothing, and it is to become something. The beginning is not pure nothing, but a nothing from which something is to proceed, end quote. Hegel. Footnote. This, the absolute, is likewise indeterminate. It merely appears, quote, as, quote, empty word and being alone, end quote, unquote. And footnote. Footnote. In this proposition, Spinoza maintained God is the infinite, unitary, and eternal substance that remains constant in its attributes. The commonality shared by substance calls for a third element. From this, Spinoza derives the concept of a being that is to be comprehended through itself. God the Absolute. See Baruch de Spinoza, Ethics Demonstrated in Geometrical Order. And Indices by Otto Bench. Introduction by Rudolf Schottlaender. Yet Spinoza's God is the determination of thought. Hegel points out that the finite contains the infinite within itself. See also his critique of Spinoza. Quote, determinateness is negation posited as affirmative. End quote. Hegel. Hegel distinguishes his concept of the infinite from that of the, quote, spurious infinite, end quote, viewed merely as a sequence, and discusses a, quote, something in relation to a, quote, other. Quote, what is actually present is that something becomes other, and the other in general becomes other. End quote. Hegel. End footnote. Footnote, a general classification is found into logic, nature, and spirit. Further subdivision, logic as, quote, the idea in and for itself, and, quote, subdivide into being, concept in itself, determinateness, magnitude, measure. Essence, concept for itself, reflection into self, appearance, actuality, and concept in and for itself, subjectivity, objectivity, idea. Nature as, quote, the idea in its otherness, end quote. Comprising mechanics, matter in general, space and time, matter and motion, absolute mechanics. Physics, physics of universal individuality, physics of particular individuality, physics as total individuality, and organics, living matter, geological nature, vegetable nature, animal organism, and spirit as, quote, the idea returning into itself from its otherness, end quote. Comprising subjective spirit, soul, consciousness, spirit, objective spirit, right, morality, ethical life, and absolute spirit, art, religion, philosophy. These are moments constituting the presupposition of experience. And footnote. Hegel's reflections incorporate presuppositions that point to dualistic constructs of pre-Hegelian philosophy: naturalism versus humanism, materialism versus idealism, empiricism versus nominalism, objectivism versus subjectivism, realism/reality versus truth, spirit, concept, category, semblance, as well as logic, necessity. The category of necessity holds a legitimate and distinguished place in logic, yet it becomes problematic in practical philosophy, for implicitly it tends towards an oblivion regarding the newly conceived determinism itself. Necessity thus points towards a negation of freedom, will, arbitrary choice, and contingency. Footnote, quote, being is first determined in relation to an other in general. Secondly, it is self-determining within itself. Thirdly, once this provisional nature of the division is cast aside, what remains is abstraction, determinateness. Abstract indeterminateness and immediacy. The state in which it must serve as the beginning, end quote. Hegel. Back to the body. Quote, thus in its transition to an other, something merely comes together with itself, and this relation to itself within the transition and with the other is true infinity, end quote. Hegel. Nevertheless, money is the beginning. Why did I say that? Nevertheless, being is the beginning. Being is the beginning. It is the, quote, reflectionless and, quote, indeterminate immediate, end quote. More precisely, quote, in its indeterminate immediacy, it is equal only to itself and not unequal to an other. It possesses no diversity either within itself or outwardly, end quote. Quote, it is pure indeterminacy and emptiness, end quote. It is then, quote, empty intuition and, quote, empty thinking and, quote, being, the indeterminate immediate, is in fact nothing, neither more nor less than nothing, end quote. Footnote, this is already found in the simple form, and this is in relation to what? Being is the beginning. This is already found in the simple form, quote, 1. The beginning of science is the immediate indeterminate concept of being. 2. In its lack of content, this is tantamount to nothing. End quote. Hegel. In the Philosophical Encyclopedia for the Upper Class, 1808. In the Nuremberg and Heidelberg writings, 1808 to 1817. Footnote, quote, because it is indeterminate, it is qualityless being. Yet in itself the character of indeterminateness attaches to it only in contrast to the determinate or the qualitative. However, determinate being as such stands opposed to being in general. Yet in this very fact, its indeterminateness constitutes its quality, end quote. It then transitions into, quote, determinate being, end quote, Dasein, end quote, being for itself, end quote. Hegel. See on this Karen Schrader-Klebert, The Problem of the Beginning in Hegel's Philosophy. Footnote. The concept of emptiness is threefold. A. As the opposite of being, it denotes non-being, as a negative. It is not yet nothing here, because the latter as a negative is already posited as positively determinate. B. He designates that which is still indeterminate, something lacking all further qualities, as conceptually empty. C. As a concept in the philosophy of nature, however, it signifies empty space or empty time, though here it already possesses initial determinations or boundaries. The authors engaged in the debate regarding this concept, in which the more astute party argued that the issue at hand was the development of pure forms, as noted under A. From a critical perspective, however, it must be noted that the concept of emptiness itself, as a superimposed notion, is employed in a broader context. This can be demonstrated by the debate concerning the philosophy of nature. And footnote. Footnote. Let us recapitulate. Being, as the indeterminate immediate, has not yet entered into Dasein, determinate being. Thus it possesses no quality. It is to acquire Dasein. Pure being conceived initially would, quote, pure being conceived initially without, quote, further determination, end quote, is thus, quote, pure indeterminacy and emptiness, end quote. Yet this state already possesses a quality, the determinacy of being empty. If pure being is to be understood as, quote, pure empty intuition, end quote, and simultaneously as, quote, empty thinking, end quote. Hegel concludes that being, as, quote, the indeterminate immediate, end quote, is therefore, quote, nothing and nothing else. This is a step too hasty. The empty is an abstraction, yet as such it is already a quality, and precisely something other than nothing. Nevertheless, for logical reasons, it can be posited as equivalent to it. Back to the text. Yet being is at the same time being its own. Yet being is at the same time its own opposite. Being must become nothing. Footnote. Quote. Being is immediately its own opposite, for it cannot be grasped due to its unity. It is merely negation. Therefore, it is the same as nothing. End quote. Karen Schrader-Klebert. Das Problem des Anfangs. Which is, what, problem of the beginning? At its core, this statement has not yet advanced to any further precision. And footnote, back to the body. Nothing is the concept corresponding to this being. Here, nothing is conceived, quote, in its indeterminate simplicity, end quote. Being and nothing are to be conceived in a unity, in which being and nothing are, on the one hand, undifferentiated, and on the other, differentiated, thereby making the movement of becoming possible. At the same time, however, the question arises as to how becoming becomes about if one starts from a doubled, empty identity. To this, Hegel replies, quote, insofar as the proposition, quote, being and nothing are the same, end quote, expresses the identity of these determinations. yet in fact contains them both as distinct. It contradicts itself and dissolves. If we examine this more closely, we find a proposition that, upon closer inspection, possesses the movement of vanishing into itself. Yet in this very process, that which constitutes its true content, namely becoming, takes place within it. End quote. Hegel. Becoming thus consists in the movement and the circumstance that pure being is immediate and simple, that it is therefore equally pure nothing, that the distinction between them exists, yet equally sublates itself and is not. The result thus asserts the distinction between being and nothing, yet is one that is merely intended. Becoming is thus conceived on the one hand as the absolute movement of mediation, which begins only with itself and is itself the whole as the mediation of absolute spirit with itself, and on the other, as the result of absolute opposition, merely empirical or natural becoming, that is the coming to be and passing away, of the finite, A new, unity is thus conceived, one that contains in itself the old forms of thought. Becoming comprises being and nothing as two unities, each of which is itself a unity of being and nothing, the one being as immediate and as a relation to nothing, the other nothing is immediate and as a relation to being, A reciprocal transition takes place. Okay, so there's a number of footnotes here. Footnote, nothing, pure nothing. It is simple equality with itself, complete emptiness, absence of determination and content, undifferentiatedness within itself. Nothing is thus the same determination, or rather absence of determination, and is therefore in general the same thing as pure being, Hegel. Logic 1. End footnote. Footnote. In order to anticipate numerous objections, Hegel formulated remarks, one of which contains a passage on non-being, characterizing non-being as a possible but inadequate concept. It states non-being contains, the relation to being, but the concern here is not initially with the form of opposition, that is a relation, but rather with abstract immediate negation, nothing purely for itself, the negation devoid of relation, Hegel. There follows references to the Eleatics, to Heraclitus, and to being as a predicate of the absolute, which turns the absolute into being, as well as to the concept of creatio ex nihilo. In this context, the absolute is the negative, that which mediates nothing with being, and thus becomes, the negative of finitude, the negative of the negative, Corinne Schrader-Klebert, Das Problem des Anfangs. End footnote. Footnote. However, the concept of unity is itself problematic, as Hegel clarifies. In this context, the so to speak unfortunate word, unity, deserves special mention. Unity, even more than identity, denotes a subjective reflection. It is taken primarily as the relation arising from comparison, from external reflection. Insofar as this finds the same thing in two different objects, a unity exists such that the complete indifference of the objects themselves, the ones being compared, to this unity is presupposed. Thus, this comparing and the unity do not concern the objects themselves, but constitute an act and determination external to them. Unity therefore expresses a wholly abstract sameness. In this respect, it would be better to speak merely of, unseparatedness, inseparability, instead of unity. Yet this fails to express the affirmative aspect of the relation of the whole, end quote. Hegel. Footnote: for Hegel, becoming signals the transition. Heidegger and Sartre, in their development from the starting point of ontological consciousness, negate or ignore it. Meinen, mere opinion intended meaning, is entirely subjective. Becoming is said to be a third element, distinct from being and nothing. End footnote. Footnote: the absolute concept is then said to be the mediation of presupposition. End footnote. Footnote, quote, becoming, coming to be and ceasing to be is the inseparability of being and nothing, not the unity that abstracts from being and nothing, but rather as the unity of being and nothing. Is that determinate unity, or the unity, it is that determinate unity, or the unity, in which both being and nothing are present. Yet insofar as being and nothing are each inseparable from its other, neither is. Thus they exist within this unity, but as vanishing merely as sublated. They sink from the independence initially attributed to them down to the status of moments, moments that remain distinct yet are simultaneously sublated, end quote. Hegel. Here, the movement appears as a specific form in which spirit, as alienated, does not yet know itself, yet is presupposed. A note on the category of becoming is to be inserted here. It is not only the, quote, Eleusinian mysteries that express the idea that change, coming to be and passing away, leaves the underlying substance untouched, setting aside Heraclitus's, quote, everything is becoming, end quote, and Empedocles', quote, double becoming, end quote. Aristotle presents several defining characteristics regarding this. Becoming is regarded as a, quote, in-between, end quote, state, between being and non-being, between dynamis, potentiality, and energeia, actuality. An answer to the problem thus posed is sought later. Footnote, and this is in relation to the sentence, Aristotle presents several defining characteristics regarding this. And the footnote says, e.g. substantial / accidental, contrary / contradictory, predicated of simple or composite subjects. End footnote. Footnote, quote, but if something changes as a whole without the persistence of anything perceptible, then it is already a process of becoming. But if within them some quality persists as the same, derived from a pair of opposites, across the states of having become and having passed away, then the state into which the transformation occurs must not be that quality. Otherwise it would be alteration, end quote. Aristotle. In the piece On Generation and Corruption. In literary theoretical reflection on the image of a declining land, where nature and humanity are envisioned both in terms of their interaction and as an ideal world, Hölderlin emphasizes that this dissolution must be conceived, so that from it, quote, so that from it, and from the surviving race, and the surviving forces of nature, which constitute the other real principle, a new world, a new yet also distinctive interaction, end quote, might emerge. The world presents itself only in a state of decline or emergence. Vitality plays a role here as well. It is a matter of the new, whereas as that which is declining constitutes, quote, negation, quote, insofar as it departs from actuality and is not yet a possibility and cannot be effective, end quote. For this reason, original language always possesses a creative aspect, quote, the emergence of the individual from the infinite and the emergence of the finite infinite, or the individual eternal from both, that is, grasping, end quote. Yet new life bears a, quote, distinctive character between being and non-being, end quote. However, there are differences between ideal and actual dissolution. Because the ideal form undergoes a specific movement, ideal dissolution is also more consistently determinable, allowing it to follow a, quote, straight, free path, end quote, and thus be, quote, truly individual, end quote. A further dimension of ideal dissolution as opposed to actual dissolution, quote, since the former moves in reverse from the infinite to the finite, after having moved from the finite to the infinite, end quote, lies in the fact that, quote, dissolution, due to the ignorance of its end and starting points, must appear simply as a real nothingness, such that everything existing, that is, everything particular, appears as the all, end quote. Hegel, right? No, it's not Hegel. Fuck. That's all these quotes have been, and like for the last paragraph, since I last said footnotes, have been from Hölderlin. Ideal dissolution is, quote, a becoming of the ideal individual into the infinitely real, and of the infinitely real into the individual ideal, end quote. Hölderlin. Yet, ultimately, the new also passes away into an intertwined process. The important insight to be gained from this is the recognition of a reversal. Passing away is becoming. Footnote, the case is different with Heidegger. There's a number of footnotes here. Footnote, the case is different with Heidegger, and this is in relation to the sentence, what? In literary theoretical reflection on the image of a declining land, where nature and humanity are envisioned both in terms of their interaction and as an ideal world, Hölderlin emphasizes that this dissolution must be conceived, quote, so that from it, and from the surviving race and the surviving forces of nature, which might constitute the other real principle, a new world, a new yet also distinctive interaction, end quote, Hölderlin, might emerge. The case is different with, and the footnote says the case is different with Heidegger, who holds that Hölderlin was concerned with the essence of poetry. See Heidegger, Hölderlin, and the Essence of Poetry, published in 1936. There, Heidegger operates with the concept of play as something merely apparent and innocent, thereby expropriating Schiller and misjudging the function that play holds within Schiller's system of aesthetics. The recourse to the gods of Greece makes the quote, essence of things and quote, manifest, and the poet's word is a quote, bestowal, in the sense of the firm grounding of human existence upon its foundations and quote. Poetry as the quote, founding of being and quote, is bound quote, to the hints of the gods and quote. It is simultaneously a quote, interpretation of the quote, voice of the people end quote, end quote. Hölderlin's poetry is bound to its time. By founding the essence of poetry, he defines the new era. Quote, it is the time of the departed gods and of the coming God. End quote. Hölderlin's essence of poetry is historical, quote, because it anticipates a historical time, yet as a historical essence there's the only essential essence, end quote. By withstanding the, quote, destitute time, end quote, the poet secures, quote, quote, truth for his people vicariously and therefore authentically, end quote. Und Hölderlin is the quote, savior of the Germans, end quote. See Walter Muschke, Zerschwatzte Dichtung in Die Zerstörung der deutschen Literatur. Note provided by Thomas Schweier. End footnote. Footnote, see Friedrich Hölderlin, Das Werden im Vergehen in Werke und Briefe, Friedrich Beisner and Johann Schmidt. See generally regarding the, quote, early Hölderlin, Dieter Henrich, Der Grund des Bewusstseins, Untersuchungen zu Hölderlins Denken, 1794 to 1795. Quote, for the world of all worlds, the all in all, which always is, manifests itself only in an all time, or in decline or in the moment, or more genetically, in the becoming of the moment and the beginning of time and the world. Let me repeat that sentence. I feel like I fucked it up too many times for it to be good. Quote, for the world of all worlds, the all in all, which always is, manifests itself only in all time, or in decline or in the moment, or more genetically in the becoming of the moment and the becoming of time and word, end quote. Friedrich Hölderlin. Beginning, decline, and language are said to be the, quote, representation of a living yet particular whole, end quote. Hölderlin. End footnote. Footnote, quote, in that which exists livingly, a specific mode of relation and mode of substance predominates, although others can be sensed in it. In that which is in transition, the possibility of all relations is dominant, yet the particular relation is to be derived or drawn from it, such that through it, infinity gives rise to the finite effect, end quote. Hölderlin. Footnote, quote, but the possible which enters into actuality as actuality dissolves. This exerts an effect and brings about both the sensation of dissolution and the recollection of what has been dissolved, end quote. Hölderlin. Footnote, quote, in the state between being and non-being, the possible becomes real everywhere, and the actual ideal. Thus, dissolution is something necessary from the standpoint of ideal recollection, becomes as such an ideal object of the newly developed life, end quote. Hölderlin. The ideal dissolution always contains the posited starting and ending points, and is thus a, quote, reproductive act, through which life traverses all its points, in order to gain the entire sum, end quote. From this recollective union emerges a, quote, comparison of the past individual and the infinitely present, end quote. Quote, the genuinely new state, end quote. Hölderlin. Footnote. It proceeds, and what proceeds? Footnote. However, there are differences between ideal and actual dissolution because the ideal form undergoes a specific movement. Footnote. It proceeds, quote, from the infinitely present to the finitely past, end quote, such that it becomes clear, quote, that 1. At every point of this same dissolution and production, 2. One point in its dissolution and production is infinitely intertwined with every other. 3. Every point in its dissolution and production is infinitely intertwined within the total feeling of dissolution and production, and everything permeates everything else, in motion and rest, in form and formlessness, end quote. Hölderlin. Footnote. Because it is adequate to the point, it can, quote, freely and completely traverse the individual point, ... in all its relations with the other points of dissolution and production, points which lie beyond the first 2 points capable of dissolution and production, namely the opposing infinitely new and finitely old, the really dead and the ideally particular, end quote. Hölderlin. And the next footnote is in relation to the sentence. A further dimension of ideal dissolution as opposed to actual dissolution, quote, since the former moves in reverse, from the infinite to the finite, after having moved from the finite to the infinite, end quote, lies in the fact that, quote, dissolution, due to ignorance of its end and starting points, must appear simply as a real nothingness, such that everything existing, that is, everything particular, appears as the all, end quote. Hölderlin, and the footnote says, here Hölderlin aims at a, quote, sensuous idealism, end quote. End footnote. And footnote. The, quote, dissolution of the ideal individual, end quote, is then not to be interpreted as, quote, weakening and death, but as a quickening, as growth, end quote. Nor is, quote, the dissolution of the infinitely new, bracket, to be seen, end bracket, as a destructive force, but as love, and both together as a transcendental creative act, whose essence is to unite the ideal individual and the real infinite, end quote. Hölderlin. In both cases, the, quote, spirit of the one unites with the sensuous tangibility of the other, end quote. Hölderlin. Footnote, quote, the moment when the period of the individual comes to an end is the moment when the infinitely new, as a dissolving unknown power, relates to the old individual, just as in the previous period the new relates to the infinitely old, as an unknown power, and these two periods stand in opposition to one another. The first is the dominion of the individual over the infinite, or the particular over the whole. The second as the dominion of the infinite over the individual, or the whole over the particular. The end of this second period and the beginning of the third lie in the moment when the infinitely new, as a sense of life, as I, relates to the old individual as an object, as non-I. Back to the body. Here we must return to Hegel's concept of becoming. Being had been conceived as immediate. However, being's simplicity revealed itself to be a relation conceived between being and nothingness. This serves as the starting point for the next moment, becoming. Quote, becoming exists only insofar as they are distinguished. The third is something other than them, end quote. Hegel in Logic 1. A condition here is that being and nothing can be isolated from one another, a problem that is then formulated. Footnote, quote, the unity whose moments, being and nothing, are inseparable is at the same time distinct from them, a third element vis-a-vis them, which in its most distinctive form is becoming. Transition is the same as becoming, save that in the former the two, from one of which the transition is made to the other, are conceived as resting more apart from one another, and the transition is occurring between them. End quote. Hegel. It is first and foremost a matter of representation. Vorstellung. End footnote. Footnote. Reference is made to Parmenides, who, even though he denied nothingness, held fast to the concept of pure being, and thus possessed a notion of the beginning. If being is grasped as a, quote, second absolute beginning, end quote, the moment of transition is simultaneously formulated, yet this moment is then merely external. End footnote. Back to the body. A problem is then formulated, quote, in the pure reflection of the beginning, as it is made in this logic with being as such, the transition is still concealed, because being is posited only as immediate. Nothingness emerges from it only immediately. End quote. Hegel. If one moves on to determinate being, Dasein, as a further determination, things become more concrete. On the other hand, even in a discussion aiming to raise objections based on the understanding, being and nothingness remain moments from which one could, in turn, abstract. For the time being, however, this remains merely a possibility, a game. To avoid falling into the, quote, external reflection, and, quote, characteristic of the understanding, one must not only begin with being, and respectively nothingness, held quote, abstractly for itself, end quote, but must also determine it further. Here the limits of discussion via the understanding become apparent. This leads on the one hand to contradiction, and on the other back to the starting point. Thus the transition to determinate being is posited. Footnote, only Dasein contains the, quote, real distinction between being and nothingness, namely a something and an other, end quote. Hegel. Footnote. Empirical Dasein is posited as underlying immediate being. Yet in this way it stands, quote, on the ground of the limit and the negative, end quote. However, the understanding grasps it, quote, in this experience, end quote. It is, quote, nothing but determinate being with a limit or negation, end quote. The alternative is implicitly considered. And there's something in Greek that translates, I guess, is the understanding thinking itself, or thinking that is and for itself. And footnote. Footnote, the same applies to, quote, nothingness, though in the opposite way. Quote, taken in its immediacy, nothingness appears as being, for by its nature it is the same as being. Nothing is thought, represented, spoken of, thus it is. Thus it is. Nothingness has its being in thinking, representing, speaking, etc. Yet this being is also distinct from it. Hence it is said that while nothingness exists in thought and representation, it does not exist for that reason. End quote. Footnote. According to this distinction, and this distinction is what distinction? The transition. This leads on the one hand to contradiction, and on the other back to the starting point. Thus, the transition to determinate being is posited. And the footnote says, according to this distinction, nothing stands, quote, in relation to being, end quote. This relation contains, quote, a unity with being, end quote. However, quote, nothing is expressed. It reveals itself, quote, in connection, end quote, or in, quote, contact with a being inseparable from a being, indeed within a determinate being, end quote. Hegel. Back to the body. Nothingness and being are determined, quote, nothingness and being are determined alternately, quote, in a determinate being, end quote. While the transition from being and nothing was abstract up to this point, it was also established that nothingness is not the ground of being. The contradictory nature of the determinations of beginning, being, and nothingness is noted not merely in response to other objections. The problem of becoming must therefore be determined differently through dialectics. Footnote, quote, but a determinateness is, as will appear further on, itself a negation. Thus they are negative nothings. Yet a negative nothing is something affirmative. The transition of nothing, through its determinateness, into an affirmative, appears to consciousness, fixed as it is in the abstraction of the understanding, as the most paradoxical thing. Conversely, however, simple the insight is, or indeed because of that very simplicity, the insight that the negation of the negation is something positive appears trivial. End quote. Hegel. And footnote. Footnote, quote, nothing can begin neither insofar as something is, nor insofar as it is not. For insofar as it is, it does not begin, and insofar as it is not, it does not begin either. If the world or something were to have begun, it would have begun in nothing. But nothing or the nothing is not a beginning. For a beginning implies being, whereas nothing contains no being. Nothing is merely nothing, in a ground cause, etc., where nothing is determined in such a way, an affirmation, a being is contained. For the same reason, something cannot cease to be, either, for that would require being to contain nothing. Yet being is merely being, not the opposite of itself. End quote. Hegel. Footnote, quote, but we call dialectic the higher rational movement, in which such things as appears absolutely separate pass over into one another through themselves, through what they are, and the presupposition, bracket, of their separateness, and bracket, sublates itself. It is the dialectical immanent nature of being and nothing themselves to reveal their unity, becoming as their truth. End quote. Hegel. Back to the body. Becoming is initially determined absolutely. Quote, becoming, coming to be and ceasing to be, is the inseparability of being and nothingness, as the unity of being and nothingness. It is that determinate unity, or the unity in which both being and nothingness are present. Yet insofar as being and nothingness are each inseparable from its other, neither is. They exist in this unity then, but as vanishing, only as sublated, end quote. They sink from the independence initially attributed to them down to moments, moments that remain distinct yet are simultaneously sublated. End quote. Hegel. Being and nothing are thus distinguished in becoming. With regard to this distinction, quote, each is within it a unity with the other, end quote. Hegel. Becoming thus contains, quote, being and nothing as two such unities, each of which is in itself a unity of being and nothing. The one being being as immediate and as a relation to nothing, the other being nothing as immediate and as a relation to being. The determinations possess unequal values within these unities, end quote. Hegel. Becoming thus exists here in a twofold determination. Quote, in the one, nothing is immediate. That is, it begins from nothing, which relates to being, i.e. passes over into being. In the other, being is immediate. That is, it begins from being, which passes over into nothing, bracket, representing, in bracket, coming to be and ceasing to be, end quote. Hegel. Both are thus, quote, the same thing, becoming, end quote. One is ceasing to be, a transition to nothing. Nothing in turn is a transition, quote, into being, coming to be, end quote. Hegel. Footnote, quote, they do not sublate one another. One does not sublate the other externally, but rather each sublates itself and is in itself its own opposite. End quote. Hegel. Back to the body. From Dasein, determinate being, the process moves to Etwas, something, to which a twofold structure is likewise ascribed, insofar as it relates both to itself and to being for another. A limit then lies between these, quote, somethings, pointing to finitude. Yet the finite ceases to be. It is simultaneously contrasted with the infinite, and a relationship of, quote, ought is conceived between the two. However, the infinite, quote, in its simple concept, end quote, as a, quote, new definition of the absolute, end quote, is itself, in its indeterminacy, merely being and becoming. Nevertheless, the concept of infinity is one that entails the dissolution of specific opposites and determinations. Some footnotes here. Footnote, insofar as reflected determinations of being come into play, such as something, other, finite, infinite, they are referred to one another. At the same time, they exist, quote, as qualitative entities for themselves. The other is, and the finite counts just as much as immediately existent as the infinite, end quote. Quote, the positive and negative, on the other hand, cause and effect, have no meaning without one another, end quote. Hegel. Here, the in itself is no longer abstract either. Hegel maintains that, quote, the finite does not produce, quote, the infinite, end quote, nor does it posit it. This is directed critically against ontological assumptions. For Adorno, by contrast, it is evident that Hegel, quote, interprets every existent as always, at the same time, something spiritual, end quote. Adorno. In Erfahrungsgehalt, content of experience. Page 73. And footnote, quote, determinate being is determinate, quote, something has a quality and is not merely determined but limited within it. Its quality is its limit, and while characterized by this, it initially remains an affirmative, tranquil, determinate being. But this negation develops in such a way that the opposition between its determinate being and the negation, as a limit immanent to it, constitutes the very, quote, being within itself, end quote, of the, quote, something, end quote, making its very existence a process of becoming. This constitutes its finitude, end quote. And I'm not sure who that quote is from, honestly. I can't tell if it's from Adorno or from Hegel. I believe it's Hegel, though. I'm going to say Hegel. And footnote, in this juxtaposition, the finite remains set in abstract opposition. If it perishes, this is a, quote, perishing, end quote. Hegel. Here, abstraction is made from the forms of determinate being. It is therefore not no essos, Aristotle, God thinking himself. Footnote, quote, it is therefore merely a lack of awareness not to see that the very designation of something as finite or limited contains the proof of the actual presence of the infinite. The unlimited, that knowledge of a limit is possible only insofar as the unlimited is present within consciousness. End quote. Hegel, Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences and Outline, 1930. A distinction is drawn between, quote, spurious infinity, end quote, parenthesis, as a mere sequence, end parenthesis, and, quote, genuine, end quote, affirmative infinity. It relates simultaneously to the finite and must thus become dynamic. Back to the body. It was necessary to grasp this horizon, at least in outline. Let us then return to Sartre here. Okay, and that is the end of the section titled A Brief Excursus on elements of Heideggerian, a brief excursus on an element of Hegelian philosophy. The next section is titled Philosophy and Existentialism 3. Thank you so much for listening.